All right, well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, The Right to a Healthy Environment, Part 1, the United Nations General Assembly's Consideration of the Right to a Healthy Environment. This is the first part of a three-part series on the right to a healthy environment. If you've not registered yet for the other two webinars in the series, please do so at eli.org. They will take place over the next 2 weeks at the same time on the same day of the week as today, so every Wednesday at noon Eastern. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a great program in store for you today. I want to take a moment to thank all of our fantastic panelists who spent a lot of time preparing wonderful content for you all today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for the program. We have several: Delaware Law School's Global Environmental Rights Institute, Barry University's Center for Earth Jurisprudence, the American Bar Association's section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the ABA Center for Human Rights. We so appreciate their help with organizing and promoting this event. I have a couple of logistical notes before we get started. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send me a direct message. That's just Environmental Law Institute, you can direct message me. And additionally, we are saving time at the end of the program for audience questions. Please don't wait until the end to submit your questions, though. As soon as you think of something you'd like to ask, please submit your questions in GoTo's questions box. I will now introduce and turn things over to our moderator, James R. May. James is a distinguished professor of law and founder of the Global Environmental Rights Institute at Widener University, Delaware Law School, and Hobb Visiting Scholar at the Hobb School of Law at Case University. James is a special representative on harmony with nature for the International Council of Environmental Law and serves as a special advisor to the American Bar Association Task Force on Environmental Justice. James has published widely in environmental human rights, including Global Environmental Constitutionalism, the Encyclopedia of Human Rights and the Environment, and the forthcoming Environmental Human Rights and the Anthropocene. James, I will turn things over to you, and thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Madison, and welcome everyone to what looks to be a fantastic panel. 2022, this year, marks the 50th anniversary of the birth of the Stockholm Declaration, the landmark international accord that acknowledged a basic right to a healthy environment. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this year, just last month, on June 21st, Costa Rica, Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland introduced a draft resolution for UN recognition of the right to a healthy environment, which the UN General Assembly took up on June 27th. The draft resolution will have its first reading tomorrow, July 7th. The UN General Assembly is likely to vote on whether to adopt the resolution later this month. The topic of today's panel is the United Nations General Assembly's consideration of the right to a healthy environment. This is the first, as Madison mentioned, of a three-part series about the UNGA's consideration of the right and what it means at the international, national, and subnational levels. Let me thank Carl Brook, Madison Calhoun, Chandler Randall, and the entire ELI team for helping with logistics for today's event. Now, today's panel will address where things stand with the resolution, the process going forward, the likelihood it will be adopted, and what it means to all of us, including in the climate context. We have a sparkling lineup for today's topic. Let me introduce them. First, we'll hear from Patricia Kamiri Mbote, and she's the director of the Law Division at UNEP. She's also professor of law and has taught for more than 30 years in universities around the world and served as dean at the Faculty of Law University of Nairobi. Dr. David Boyd is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment and a professor at the University of British Columbia. He has written 10 books and more than 100 reports and articles on environmental law and policy, human rights, and constitutional law. Daniel Zavala Paras is Minister Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations in New York. He served as Executive Secretary of the National Commission for the Follow-up and Implementation of International Human Rights Obligations, and is a member of the co-chair team of the Negotiating Committee of the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Dr. Maria Antonia Tigre is the Global Climate Litigation Fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School and the Deputy Director of the Global Network of Human Rights and the Environment. So today's panel will proceed in 4 parts in 75 minutes. First will be a suite of 5-minute remarks from each panelist to frame today's discussion. Second, we'll have a discussion, beginning with opening questions called queuing questions for each panelist. Third, we'll address questions from you, as Madison described, as posed to the panel. And then, time permitting, we'll give each panelist a closing comment and then adjourn. So let's begin with the opening remarks. First with Patricia. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good evening, good afternoon, and good day to all participants. I'd like to thank the Environmental Law Institute and other partnering institutions for organizing this important and timely meeting on the UN General Assembly resolution on the right to a healthy environment. UNEP supports the UN recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, and sanitation. A healthy environment depends on the exercise of human rights, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is actually recognized by over 155 states at the national and regional levels, and has been recently recognized by the historic Human Rights Council Resolution 48/13 in October last year. The roots of the right to a healthy environment can be traced back to the declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, the Stockholm Declaration 1972, which initiated the creation of the United Nations Environment Programme. The first principle of the Stockholm Declaration states that people have the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. The advancement and implementation of the right to a healthy environment are firmly rooted in the work of UNEP. And in addition to the implementation of the Secretary General's call to action for human rights and the Secretary General's common agenda, UNEP has been supporting states and been working with UN entities, civil society, and indigenous organizations, national human rights institutions, and business actors to make the right to a healthy environment a reality for all. The United Nations General Assembly recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is essential to make the right truly universal. As important as the United Nations Human Rights Council's action was, recognition of the right by the UN General Assembly, the UN body to which all UN member states belong, elevates the right to where it belongs, universal recognition, which is a powerful catalyst for accelerated environmental action. Adopting this resolution would help states to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Adopting the resolution would also help people stand up for their right to breathe clean air and their right to access safe and sufficient water, healthy food, healthy ecosystems, and non-toxic environments. Adopting the resolution would also send a message that nobody can take nature, clean air and water, or a stable climate away from us, at least not without a fight. If history repeats itself, it could also inspire states that haven't constitutionalized the right to do so. When the Assembly adopted a resolution in July 2010 recognizing the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation, it was a catalyst for governments all over the world to add the right to water to their constitutions, their highest and strongest laws. Finally, UNEP welcomes and fully supports the ongoing discussions on the General Assembly resolution recognizing the right. We welcome and are highly encouraged by the ongoing discussion on the recognition of these rights at the Assembly, And we are proud to continue supporting the core group, Costa Rica, Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, with the critical and history-making steps towards the universal recognition of the right to a clean and healthy environment. It has been 50 years since Stockholm Declaration was adopted. We cannot wait any longer for the formal and universal recognition of the right. The time is indeed now. UNEP looks forward to the successful adoption of the General Assembly resolution. Thank you.
And thank you, Patricia, for those wonderful opening remarks. We really appreciate it. David, we're next with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jimmy, and delighted to be on a panel with all of you here today. I think it's really important to reiterate the fact that we are living in the midst of an unprecedented global environmental crisis, the climate emergency, the collapse of biological diversity, pervasive toxic pollution that causes more than 9 million premature deaths every year, and of course, a surge in emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin spilling over from wildlife into humans. And in response to this global environmental crisis, we have the world's leading scientific experts, whether they're with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, similar body on biodiversity and ecosystem services, the World Health Organization, saying that we need to make transformative changes to society in order to successfully address this crisis. And if we look at the past several centuries of human history, we see that human rights have actually been a catalyst for the types of transformative changes we need today. You can look at the way that the abolitionists used freedom and equality, those basic human rights, to achieve the end of slavery. We can look at the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, the use of rights by indigenous peoples, by LGBTQ+ persons, by persons with disabilities. None of these social movements have completely succeeded, but they have made transformative changes in human society. And in the face of the global environmental crisis, it's so timely and so encouraging and inspiring to see the emergence of this global movement pushing for recognition that everyone everywhere has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. As Patricia mentioned, really the time is now. And interestingly, this is a right that, as Patricia said, is already recognized in law by over 150 countries around the world through their constitutions, through their legislation, and as parties to regional human rights treaties that include this right. So we have a track record of decades of experience that shows us what a difference this right can make. It is a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and policies, such as Costa Rica's world-leading law on biodiversity, or the recent French law that prohibits France from exporting pesticides to the global south when those pesticides are not allowed to be used in the European Union. The right to a healthy environment is also a catalyst for improved implementation and enforcement of these stronger laws and policies. It is a catalyst for higher levels of public participation, greater levels of accountability, and most importantly, we have conclusive evidence that the right to a healthy environment makes a difference in people's lives. Countries that recognize this right in their constitutions have achieved faster reductions in air pollution, faster reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and higher levels of people living with access to safe drinking water. And the right to a healthy environment includes a bundle of substantive rights as well as procedural rights. So it includes the right to breathe clean air, the right of access to safe and sufficient water, the right to healthy and sustainably produced food, the right to live, work, study, and play in non-toxic environments, and the rights to healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, which are the foundation of all life on Earth, as well as the right to live in a safe, livable climate. Those substantive elements are complemented by a toolbox of procedural rights that enable citizens and communities to protect their rights. And those are the rights of access to environmental information, to participate in decision-making about environmental impacts, and also the right of access to justice with effective remedies. And because the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is recognized as a human right, it's also subject to of Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, first at the Human Rights Council last year, and now at the General Assembly, taking the leadership in changing the entire scope of human rights by adding this right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment to the catalog of human rights that is universally recognized. So my gratitude to the leadership of that core group. Very excited to see what happens in the weeks ahead at the General Assembly, and I'll turn the floor back to you, Jimmy.
David, thank you so much for those inspiring and insightful remarks as ever. Daniel, you're next. Thank you. So Daniel, I think if you're looking for the way to unmute, it's in the upper right-hand corner, if you can see it on your screen.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you
So much. This is my first time with this platform, so apologies for my amateur handling of the technology. Thank you so much. In the first place, I would like to thank the Environmental Law Institute and all the co-organizers of this very important webinar, and my appreciation particularly to you, James, but also to Patricia, David, Maria Antonia. It's really a pleasure to share this webinar with experts, with practitioners who are on the ground and from different sides of this beautiful multilateral work to push for a common objective that is also ours. As you have said, well, I work for the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica in New York, working currently with other 4 colleagues of this core group of countries, co-presenters of this draft resolution to the General Assembly, entitled The Human Right to a Clean, Healthy and Sustainable Environment, namely Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Costa Rica. As you have said, James, we are just in the middle of this process, intergovernmental the process of negotiating a draft resolution to be adopted by the General Assembly. And so in this regard, I apologize in advance for any maybe not as insightful comment I would be making, just because as you understand, we don't want by no reason to prejudge this process. But certainly we have a vision as co-presenters of this draft resolution, and we have a common purpose as well that is shared by other member states. So I hope to also be able to deliver this message on behalf of my colleagues of the core group. As you know, on the 21st of June, the co-presenters of this draft resolution invited member states to a presentation of the resolution, which took place last 27th of June. We are preparing now the first reading of the text, which will take place, as a matter of fact, tomorrow, with the participation of member states and observers. So where do we come from? Of course, this proposal to the General Assembly is for us a logical step after the adoption by the Human Rights Council of Resolution 48/13 and the operative paragraph that invites the General Assembly to remain seized of the matter. But our decision to present this resolution is also, in our view, the culmination of a long process of, as you have said, around 50 years at least since the first declaration in Stockholm, whereby it was stated that people have a fundamental right to an environment of a quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. But it is over the last 20 years that these efforts to include the right at the international level has been growing ever stronger at the international community. It is in the developments at the national and regional levels, some of which have been mentioned here, that we find a solid legal basis and the case for the universal recognition of this right. It is in this sense, in this regard, not the creation of a new right, but in our view, it is the culmination of a long history of this human right. We understand that the world is facing, as we speak, an unprecedented global environmental crisis, or a triple planetary crisis, as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations uses to say, made of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for instance, has also warned that the world has never seen a human rights threat of this scope. So it is in the face of this critical juncture we live in that we are convinced that the universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment can provide a powerful and effective rights-based response, which not only catalyzes transformative changes in society and countries, but ultimately places human well-being and the enjoyment of all human rights at the center of prosperity and human well-being for all. In this regard, respecting and fulfilling this right should ensure a minimum level of environmental quality for all members of society, consistent with international standards. Or as Eleanor Roosevelt used to say with respect to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a common standard of achievement for humanity. And I quote Mrs. Roosevelt. It is needless to say that this resolution will not be a legally binding document. The significance of this recognition, of this universal recognition, is indeed political. We are talking about leadership by the international community to rally behind a noble endeavor that has human beings and it's at its center of concern. It is about hope to communities, vulnerable populations, who will be able to benefit from an increased attention to this issue. And it is also a boost to multilateralism, which has been and continues to be our most precious asset, especially for small countries like mine, who deeply believe in international law. It is the most precious asset to face our common challenges and achieve our highest aspirations. Our countries, who are representatives of all regions and united in this strong support for this recognition, are convinced, in light of these elements, that the time is ripe. And so we have decided to present this resolution at the current session of the General Assembly, which would be considered as the right step after the Human Rights Council adoption in October last year. Looking at the substance of the text of this draft 0 that is now being presented to member states for negotiation, the co-presenters of the draft resolution have opted for a technical approach to the text, based fundamentally on the agreed language of the Human Rights Council. Our purpose is indeed to preserve the balance and the compromise reached at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and at the same time to use this as a basis to set the bar higher with the support, of course, of member states. This resolution does not drive us away from fundamental principles of international human rights law and international environmental law, but rather reinforces them. The recognition of this human right is, in the vision of the co-presenters, a one-shot opportunity. We need this recognition to be made once, and after that, a great focus could be placed on its implementation. So as others have said, we join the motto, "The time is now," for the universal recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And as indicated, we will be conducting, we have started already this process of intergovernmental negotiations, where we will listen definitely to all member states. We want this to be a process as open, as inclusive, as transparent as possible, and we would do our best to do so. I will finish with two brief remarks from my side now, with my more national hat, saying that Costa Rica has this experience indeed of the 1994 constitutional adoption of a right to a healthy environment and ecologically sound environment, which has triggered so many developments in my country, positive developments towards the environment. We, of course, do not feel champions of this issue, but rather a long walk still to be made from our side. But cognizant of the developments, of the impact that this recognition had in my country, we also very much hope and will advocate certainly in our work to have this right finally universally recognized. And finally, on a personal note, I want to say that we talk so much about intergenerational equity. I have to say we are a group of 5 experts, relatively young, maybe younger than others, some of us, but definitely I feel also very, very proud and honored to learn from expert voices and to bring this contribution from a young perspective as well to this conversation. So personally, it's definitely a real honor and pleasure. So thank you again for the invitation, and happy to respond to any question. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your energy and enthusiasm for this consideration of international recognition of the right. It is indeed, as you say, a long walk. It's also something that involves an awful lot of investment from many players, including our next speaker, Maria Antonia. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And it's really a big pleasure to be part of this discussion, especially with people who are very deeply engaged in that process. I'm just really a bystander and just like watching all of you work and have been analyzing it. And my whole interest with that came from me following the negotiations on the Global Pact for the Environment, which eventually failed, but as part of my PhD thesis. But as part of that, I really started looking at the deep roots of that recognition and how that's actually everywhere already. So I'll talk a little bit about one of the chapters of my thesis, which I completed earlier this year, which really goes into those deep philosophical and ideological and religious roots of the right to a healthy environment. Basically, the underlying premise here is that the whole world already agrees to this, so it's already there. We just need to that actual legal recognition at the international level. So as David already mentioned, and Patricia, we all really know that the scientific angle of all of this, that we have reached those tipping points. We are in the Anthropocene, and that there is a scientific consensus that really exposes this need for a new legal framework. So we need these new legal tools to address the crisis that we are facing right now, and that ecological transformation really needs to be grounded in a new body of transformative law, and that starts with the international recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And what I was looking at, this research that I did, is really sort of the moral compass that we already share throughout the world, that the foundation for these shared legal principles that can foster progressive development of international environmental law and a transition to a nature-guided future. So I think the main questions here is how can we draw from these lessons and really ensure that this progressive development exists, right, of international environmental law. We're 50 years after the Stockholm Declaration, and a lot has happened, but at the same time, a lot has not happened. So we need to sort of move a little faster, because the scientific, the science is developing and showing us that the world is changing, and we need to do something about it. And we're always, us from the legal perspective, we're always several steps behind in responding to that. But sort of looking a little bit to Latin America, where I'm from, I sort of analyzed the indigenous roots that come from that deep connection with nature and the protection of nature, but also Catholicism and African traditions within Brazil as well, sort of that hybrid mix of cultures and thinking, like the philosophical and religious thinkings that really relate a lot to the land and the mix of people, and that really value the biodiversity and understand sort of the loss for future generations, and how that tradition of even from a cultural perspective of sharing that knowledge that has been going on and on for generations, is deeply rooted in the protection of nature, right? In a lot of it in the Amazon rainforest, where I focus a lot of my work in. So, and that is the same throughout the world, sort of the indigenous beliefs in other parts of the world as well, but also from a religious perspective, right? That all of the religions, I'm generalizing here, obviously, but that research gave examples from different parts of the world, but basically assessing that deep connection with nature exists, and that duty to protect nature. So, you're all sort of the experts here on the right to a healthy environment. I'm not gonna talk too much about that because I think you all, the panelists here, know a lot more than I do, but obviously this has already been recognized throughout the world in several constitutions, and so that obviously brings that the codification of that moral and spiritual religious protection that we see across many cultures, but there are still some others that are missing, right? And the significance of having that international recognition is enormous, right? Even if continuing from that moral perspective too, right? So that we'll have that, even if it is soft law, and there's a lot of discussion on what exactly that means, which I'm sure, will create a lot of interesting discussions moving forward. But, we've all sort of agreed that there is a right to a healthy environment, and there is a duty to protect the environment, because our lives and our livelihoods and our children's lives are at stake here. So it's just a matter of actually recognizing that. So I'm very happy to be, here talking about this and seeing this and following that process in person. It's really, I think, a privilege to see, all of you work on this and be a small part of it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Antonia. You're a huge part of it. Thank you for those perspectives about the moral and religious dimensions of recognizing the right internationally as well. So now let's turn to the discussion part of today's panel. And the first queuing question goes to Patricia. And that is, what difference would the UNGA recognition of a right to a healthy environment make at UNEP in general? That's first. And in implementing existing multilateral environmental agreements in particular. Take it away, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the recognition of the right to a healthy environment is going to deepen the work that we do as UNEP. In our current medium-term strategy, we are looking at different transformative actions that are both for people and the planet. And the right to a healthy environment is going to be the basis for these transformative multi-stakeholder actions that target the root causes and drivers of environmental change that are responsible for the crisis that David Bird was talking about. So in a sense, I could say that the right to a healthy environment recognition is going to be the wind in the sails of a lot of the work that UNEP does. And relatedly, we have many multilateral environmental agreements addressing diverse environmental challenges, from nature loss to chemicals and pollution. And the recognition of the right is going to help in the implementation of these different environmental agreements, but also help us frame the responses to the plastic pollution now that we are working on a new agreement. So having the recognition of the right to a healthy environment as we negotiate a new plastic pollution treaty is really going to be very, very important and framing. And for UNEP at 50, finally, we are looking, it took 50 years. If we get it this year, this is the 50th year, and if we can have the recognition of the right to a healthy environment now, then it means that the actions that we take going forward are going to be anchored on these strong political agreement that this is indeed important, not just for people, but also for the resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Now, we have just maybe about a minute and a half for follow-up conversation about this queuing question, but I invite anyone on the panel to add to what Patricia just said. Thank you.
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say I agree with everything that Patricia said, and I also think that the right to a healthy environment and which requires states to take a human rights-based approach to these problems, a human rights-based approach to climate action, a human rights-based approach to biodiversity conservation, a human rights-based approach to pollution, really kind of provides a sense of accountability that some of these international environmental agreements are lacking. And so, you know, if a country is not complying with its commitments under the Paris Agreement or the Convention on Biodiversity or the Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's very difficult using environmental law to hold them accountable for those failures. But when we bring human rights into the equation, we get this kind of synergy between human rights law and environmental law, which enables citizens, communities, civil society to actually hold governments accountable to fulfill the commitments and the promises that they have made. And so I think that's a very powerful combination of these two fields of law that we're just beginning to understand.
Okay, yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, there were more than 5,000 agreements I was reading that touch or concern environmental natural resource matters across the globe. There's an awful lot of potential, as you mentioned, to incorporate human rights ideals into implementing those MEAs. Maria Antonia or Daniel, anything else you'd like to add to that? Okay, so David, you're next. The next queuing question is this one. How might the United Nations General Assembly recognition, if that happens, affect global recognition and implementation of the right to a healthy environment in constitutions, courts, and boardrooms? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is we really need to make it clear that a General Assembly resolution of this nature is not a legally binding or enforceable type of law. It's soft law, as Maria Antonia mentioned, but it is intended to serve as a catalyst for accelerated state and business action at all levels to fulfill the right to a healthy environment. And so if we consider this, I can appreciate that some people are skeptical about the impact of UN General Assembly resolutions. But if we look back at the resolution from 2010 on the right to water and sanitation, we can see the way that that has had a catalytic effect around the world. So we have countries that have added the right to water to their constitutions, including Costa Rica, but also from all over the world, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, Tunisia. We have other countries like France and Colombia that have incorporated the right to water into legislation. And most importantly, we have seen governments place higher priority on fulfilling and respecting, protecting, and fulfilling people's rights to water and sanitation. So, for example, in Mexico, after the UN resolution in 2010, the government of Mexico changed the constitution to include the right to water and then put in place a program that has in the past decade delivered safe drinking water to more than 1,000 rural communities in Mexico, changing those people's lives for the better. In my own country of Canada, we've seen a country which Canada actually abstained from that resolution in 2010. But once it was adopted by the UN, Canada changed its position, recognized the right to water, and in the last 7 years has worked with more than 130 Indigenous communities to deliver safe drinking water that had been missing for decades for those communities. Again, changing people's lives. In Slovenia, the government has made a concerted effort to provide safe drinking water to Roma communities, you know, one of these vulnerable and marginalized peoples. And that has, again, changed people's lives in those Roma communities. So the recognition of the right to water and sanitation by the United Nations in a resolution similar to the proposed resolution on the right to a healthy environment has been absolutely transformative. And I think, you know, most of the action happens at the national level where the right to a healthy environment becomes an obligation, not an option. And that really is powerful in terms of the way governments address these issues.
Thank you so much, David. And following up to that obligation and not an option framing, let me invite others on the panel to weigh in. Maria Antonia, Daniel, or Patricia, thank you. Sure.
I think the points that I think it's, talking a little bit about Brazil, where I come from, we've been seeing a lot of regression in environmental protection. And it's been really interesting to see how so many of the litigation cases, well, not only climate litigation, but also general environmental cases, and are actually really grounded on the right to a healthy environment. So that really is sort of the main, the main legal grounds to actually ensure that that regression, is unconstitutional, and that there's something that is done about it. So, we can really see it in practice, how even when there's a change of government and environmental protection is no longer a priority, it's still, having that recognition of the right to a healthy environment is the way to sort of lead back into that.
Okay. Daniel, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, I have not much to say what the experts are indeed explaining. What I would like to say is that the way we also see the contribution from this recognition is in a three level, right? The communities, empowering communities, as for instance the special rapporteur David has mentioned. At the national level, we see the power of this the recognition to set a standard. But I have to say here that for some countries, it also means we say in Spanish, a suelo, the soil on which to build. I mean, we come from different developments at the national level, and so what we're trying to put up is a standard, but on which countries can identify themselves, indeed. So this is the second layer, and the third level, finally, that goes perhaps a little bit beyond the scope of the direct implications on environmental protection and human rights, is indeed how the international community can come together under a common goal in a context, in a moment of time where multilateralism and the rules-based order is indeed under immense strain. We know that. So the effort we are putting up as a core group, as co-presenters, we feel goes also beyond the specific implications of this recognition, but rather how the international community can come up again, convene again, and rally together under a very human and very pressing also demand that is this recognition. So just wanted to bring also that scope. Thank you.
Yes. Patricia, anything else before we move on?
I'd just like to say that having the right recognized in very many national constitutions is just one level, and I think this is what Daniel is saying. But having at the UN level the acceptance of the right to a healthy environment, even in a soft law instrument, I think is a validation and a necessary push for getting the actions that are needed at the national level.
Yes, exactly. It's a great point, Patricia. And as David points out, the international recognition of a right to water and sanitation had that transformative effect, and it took, I know this is exaggerating a little bit, but really just a decade to change the way that water and sanitation was viewed as a right across the globe. So let's move on to the next question. Thank you for all of those comments. The next queuing question, Daniel, is for you, and that is this: what is the process and what are the prospects for UNGA recognition of this right? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, this process is somehow no different from other processes of GA General Assembly resolutions. So we need co-presenters of an initiative, after which a process of intergovernmental consultations is launched in order to basically negotiate on the text that is proposed. We, in this regard, we feel that we take the baton this time, but we know we are not alone in this initiative, in this endeavor. There are many member states who, as the experts have said here, have recognized already the right at the national level, and that they are supportive of this initiative. We are really pleased by the support expressed, timid or strong support expressed during the presentation of this draft resolution last week. Of course, this is just the beginning. We are aware that we need to work with member states to address their concerns and to see where we can find middle grounds where it is possible indeed. But we are encouraged by the signs and the expressions of support so far. I have to say that at this stage, as we speak, we are gathering more and more sponsorships by member states, and this shows us only that there is indeed a widespread support by the General Assembly to this issue. Of course, as I said, we don't want to prejudge anything that might come from the negotiations, but we are really hopeful. Really, we are really hopeful that this is finally the time where member states can gather and universally recognize these human rights. So we of course want to work with everyone. We will need everyone's support, and not the least by member states. And we are confident that with this strong support by all actors, we can achieve a successful outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And to keep us on track for the next question, if I could just ask, are there any comments from the panel about this one, about the maybe speaking in ways that Daniel's not at liberty to say just yet, but how the likelihood, pardon me, that the resolution will pass? Thank you.
Well, I think there's a huge probability of success here. I mean, I don't want to prejudge the outcome either. But if you look at what happened in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, we had 43 states vote in favor, no states vote against, and just 4 states abstain. So I would really anticipate that I would hope that this resolution will be adopted ideally by consensus, but if not by consensus, then by a landslide of support.
Okay, thank you, David. Let's turn to our final queuing question, and Maria Antonia, it goes to you. And that is this: what difference might recognition of a right to a healthy environment mean for climate litigation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I think, it's, we've been seeing, a lot of scholars have talked about this rights turn in climate litigation, right? That there are a lot of cases, more recent cases, that have really been grounded on the rights on human rights in general, but then on the right to a healthy environment specifically, where that recognition exists, right? So that includes a majority of cases, the majority of cases in the global south specifically. That's what we have been observing as part of this work that I do at the Sabin Center with the climate litigation database that we do have. And I think whenever, there has been a lot of success in making that link, right, to with establishing climate rights. However, that is sometimes it's related to the right to life, the right to health, but then specifically on the right to a healthy environment, it can be even more significant, right? And with that international recognition, I think that could be catalyzed even more. And I just wanted to bring a recent example of that through a decision that came out last week in Brazil. This was a case related to a mechanism, a financial mechanism from the government called the Climate Fund, which was established a while ago, basically to bring funds for mitigation and adaptation measures, right? So it's a government mechanism that received funds from from Scandinavian countries, but other sort of development banks as well. And then basically that fund was managed by the Brazilian Development Bank and then allocated to projects in mitigation and adaptation. There was this one, and then there was an Amazon fund that worked in the same way, but related to projects to reduce deforestation, right? So there were two cases that were filed at the same time, one related to each. And the cases were filed by political parties, which was sort of a specific, procedural mechanism in Brazil, that then the cases went directly to the Constitutional Court, to the Supreme Court, and grounded obviously on the right to a healthy environment, which is very prominent in the Brazilian Constitution. It was very beautifully written since 1988 when the Constitution was adopted. So, in 2020, this was filed in 2020, and then there were public hearings on both cases, which was also, a very innovative way of doing things, in which basically the justices of the court asked experts, around the world to basically give them the facts of climate change in one case, and then on deforestation on the other, right? From a lot of them from Brazil, but then experts from around the world too, and basically trying to understand, what are we talking about here in terms of the science, because then we could reach a decision on the legal issues. And basically what they were questioning here is that in the Bolsonaro administration, the funds basically stopped spending the money, even though the money was there. So it was a sort of an implementation of the funds, which they argued was unconstitutional. So I'm giving sort of a little bit long explanation here, but just to reach this amazing decision that came out last week, in which the court basically said that the Paris Agreement is a human rights treaty. I think you can all remember the whole discussion when the Paris Agreement was adopted on whether to adopt, to have a human rights approach in it or not. Just eventually was included in the preamble only, so not in the operative piece of the agreement. But basically what the court was saying, that it doesn't matter, it is a constitutional, it's a human rights treaty, and through that, that means that it has supranational status. So that means that it goes above all of the other laws that are not human rights or constitutional law. So whenever there's a new law or an executive decree or something, a policy that goes against the Paris Agreement, and that means mitigation measures and the goal of reaching 2 degrees Celsius, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and all of that, then that's unconstitutional, which is huge, right? And that's it's absolutely 100% grounded on the right to a healthy environment, which is in the Constitution. So this is sort of like a little snippet of it. There's a lot to unpack in that decision, and I think that's going to have huge implications for for Brazil and for other countries as well, which could potentially reach the same conclusion. But I just sort of wanted to mention that to give the example of what type of impact that could have.
Thank you, Maria Antonia. That was fantastic. What exciting news again, just from last week in this realm. We have, to keep us on track, we have 2 more minutes to discuss this particular question. Let me invite anyone on the panel to weigh in further about what recognition might mean for climate litigation. Thank you.
I think if you consider the fact that the right to a healthy environment wasn't much spoken about many years ago, and most people actually pegged it on the right to life. And now there is the recognition in Constitution, and we hope that it will be recognized at the General Assembly. This is going to help different actions that parties want to bring on climate, because from the climate litigation reports that UNEP has produced, quite a lot of actions are really human rights related. So this is going to be one extra push for litigants that want to bring the matter before courts.
Okay, good.
And I would just add quickly that, litigation only happens when governments are failing to fulfill their human rights and environmental obligations. The optimal situation is where they respect, protect, and fulfill this right without having to be dragged to court. So when we have, leading countries like Costa Rica and France and Sweden, those governments have nothing to fear from climate litigation, because they are effectively carrying out their obligations both under environmental law and human rights law. So I think the key is, and what we should be aiming for, is to put the laws and policies, constitutions, programs in place that enable us to undertake that shift, a rapid shift from the fossil fuel economy of today to the renewable energy economy of tomorrow. And litigation really comes in when governments and businesses are dragging their heels and need to be held accountable to actually live up to the commitments they've made.
Thank you. It was terrific. Daniel, anything else you want to add to that before we move on to the next part of our program?
Well, I have not much to say really to add to what David and Patricia have said. Only that for us, again, this will represent a standard for some. Hopefully, those states that have not recognized it yet could have an incentive now to do so. And for those who have recognized it already and at the national level, it will certainly mean a potentiator, right, a catalyzer of more environmental action. But definitely, there's a key concept here, a rights-based response to our environmental crisis, and this is also what we're looking for. Just adding this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, rights-based responses, which we'll get into with the questions. So first, let me congratulate the panel. We are exactly on time. And so we have time for questions from the audience. So those of you who have submitted questions, we'll do our best to get to all of them as quickly as we can. Saying that, it's unlikely that we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So the first question sort of is a follow-up to these rights-based approaches, and I'll read it. And I invite anyone from the panel to provide a brief response. So here's the question. If the General Assembly, wait, I just lost it. Sorry. If the General Assembly adopts the resolution, how do you, panel, suggest environmentalists use it to convince arbitrators that investor expectations under bilateral trade agreements should be limited by state obligations to ensure a healthy environment? That's sort of like a stump the panel question, but I invite anyone to give it a shot. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to give it a first try, and then my colleagues on the panel can correct my errors. But this raises an issue that's highly problematic in today's world, that there are hundreds of these multilateral and bilateral trade and investment treaties, which include investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. And those, when disputes arise under these treaties, they are not decided by the courts of national jurisdiction. They're decided by these arbitration panels. And these types of cases have already proven highly problematic in that corporations are bringing cases against governments when governments undertake environmental actions or climate change actions that are absolutely essential to addressing the climate emergency, but that harm the corporate interests. For example, you have cases in Europe where countries have made the decision to move away from coal-fired electricity generation, which is a critical part of addressing the climate crisis, and then have been the subject of lawsuits by corporations seeking to recoup their future profits if those coal plants had been allowed to remain open. And so not only is that problematic in those contexts, but it also causes a chilling effect. It discourages governments from taking the actions that are absolutely essential to addressing the climate and nature crises. And so the General Assembly resolution on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, to the extent that that can be recognized and entrenched in national law in the way it is in Costa Rica and more than 150 countries around the world, that actually provides governments with a defense against these types of cases. There have been situations in Costa Rica, El Salvador, where cases have been brought by mining companies, for example, and those countries have been able to successfully defend those cases by arguing that their actions were intended to protect the human rights of their citizens, and in particular, the right to a healthy environment. So this General Assembly resolution has the potential of partially addressing the concerns raised by those investor-state claims under these international trade and investment treaties. I hope that wasn't too complicated of an answer, but it's a complex area of law.
Well, you made the complex very easy to understand. Really appreciate the thorough response. And let me turn to the next question, which, Daniel, I think this one is most likely maybe directed toward you. So, but just let's give it a shot. Will the General Assembly resolution, if adopted, push nations toward ratifying the Escazú Agreement or adopting it, and for that matter, the Aarhus. So I think the question goes to what's the relationship between the UNGA's recognition and the Escazú and Aarhus conventions? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think this question might deserve an entire presentation, an entire webinar, right? Definitely. But I have to say that we have indeed in the Geneva resolution, the 14/13, and our operative paragraph that speaks about precisely the relationship between these human rights and the fulfillment of all multilateral environmental agreements. Including, of course, this new groundbreaking, I would say, as having been part of the committee that adopted that treaty, a groundbreaking instrument such as the Escazú Agreement. Hopefully, and I'm speaking here for my country, hopefully this recognition would help us ratify the Escazú Agreement, but also deepening our understanding of what environment overall means for human rights, and what also human rights can provide to the protection of the environment.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for that as well. So we have 7 more fantastic questions to get through, so we'll do our best here, and that would put us just at the right time.
Jimmy, can I just make a quick addition to what Daniel said? Sorry for jumping in, but first of all, I think, yes, the General Assembly resolution should provide a nudge in the Latin America and Caribbean region for more states to ratify the Escazú Agreement. Right now, there's only 13 out of the 33, so there's definitely work to be done there. And I think it's also exciting that this General Assembly resolution could also provide a nudge in Africa and Asia to develop their own regionally specific agreements on environmental democracy, including the rights to information, participation, and access to justice. Thank you.
Yeah, another great point. Thank you. Okay, here's the next question. Patricia, my guess is this one might be directed at you, but I don't know. This is another just easy question, no big deal, but here we go. I was hoping, the person asking the question was hoping that the panel could give their thoughts on the wave of reviews and upgrades of social and environmental safeguard frameworks at the World Bank, the Global Environmental Fund, the United Nations Environment Program, and others, and to what extent they contribute to the protection of the realization of the right to a healthy environment. Here's the question: how can these other entities operate a shift to a human rights-based approach to environmental challenges? Patricia, you want to give that one a try?
Yes, I will, and my colleagues can contribute. I think the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, even as a political declaration at that high level, is going to create pressure on different institutions. Already, these institutions do feel the pressure to ensure that there's protection of the environment. That's why we have the safeguards. And this is, I think, why the environment and social governance realm has really grown. In fact, if you look at many companies and many private actors now, the concern were to be involved in networks where you're looking at sustainable consumption and production, which is really not because there is any legal binding, but because there is a push. And I think with the human rights, with the recognition of the human right to a healthy environment, this push is going to be a lot more and felt by different actors more.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Patricia. Let me invite any follow-up from the panel.
Just, I can't help jumping in. I'm sorry, my apologies. But I also think that, this General Assembly resolution will provide momentum to all kinds of ongoing international processes. So Patricia has already mentioned the negotiation of a future treaty on plastic pollution. Critically important that we have a rights-based approach. And I would really argue for the inclusion of the right to a healthy environment in the text of that agreement. We have ongoing negotiations about a post-2020 global framework for biodiversity conservation. The right to a healthy environment is in that draft text, but it's in brackets. And I think if this General Assembly resolution is adopted, that will ensure that it stays in the text. Same with the proposed UN treaty on businesses and human rights. It's currently in the draft text, but again, if there's a General Assembly resolution, then states are really have a tough time arguing that it should come out. So I think it will have this kind of influence in all of these different processes around the world that's really timely and essential.
Thank you for that too. All right, the next question, Maria Antonia, I'll direct it to you. Because I think at center it's also about climate litigation. But the question is this: how successful do you think the children's right to a healthy environment litigation will be? Any thoughts on that? Thank you, Maria Antonia.
Thank you. That's a great question and very fitting because I have a little one here who just woke up. But I think that the recognition of the right to a healthy environment will be very, very significant for climate litigation brought by children specifically. And there's a whole other process too going on at the Committee on the Rights of the Child on a general comment on children's rights and the environment as well, which obviously, like David said, is going to get an impetus from this to get a little boost from this recognition. So, obviously, like there's a whole set of children's rights which are obviously affected by environmental issues and by climate issues specifically, and there's a lot of litigation related to that in the climate arena, which has some of it has been successful, a lot of it is pending. But I think that the recognition at the international level by the UNGA will be hugely important for that, for sure.
Okay. Thank you, Maria Antonia. Here's the next question. And I'm condensing a little bit for the person who asked, so please forgive me, but how can international decision makers, and I don't know to whom to direct this question, so I just invite the panel. How can international decision makers and actors such as the UNGA and UNEP, I would presume, address gaps to ensure that the LGBTQ+ community and their environmental experiences are not left behind in the future development and implementation of this right?
Maybe I'll jump in, but that's an extremely important question, and I think like obviously the recognition will affect everyone, but then we'll have to start talking about the vulnerabilities, right? The people who are affected in different ways by environmental issues and by climate change specifically. So then we talked about children, but then LGBTQ people, and then like women. There's so many different groups that. Indigenous groups as well. There's a whole other conversation, which I think we could also have a whole webinar on it. But then I think these conversations will start to happen as well, and to see how implementation could target these groups specifically.
Yeah, and I think Maria Antonia is totally correct, and I think that's one of the most important aspects of taking a rights-based approach to the climate emergency, to the collapse of biodiversity and pervasive pollution, is that a rights-based approach is open and inclusive. It ensures that we engage everybody in the processes of identifying the impacts and also developing the solutions. And it really does, a rights-based approach requires states and businesses to identify the people who are being most directly affected. And we know, for example, I've done several missions to small island states in my role as UN Special Rapporteur, and where those small island states have been hit by extreme weather events such as cyclones or hurricanes, there have definitely been issues with LGBTQ+ persons being denied access to shelters, for example. And so this is a way that the climate emergency is having a disproportionate impact on this vulnerable community. And that's something that is put front and center when we use a rights-based approach to climate change.
Okay, thank you, David. Here's the last question, given where we are with timing. So upcoming will be the fourth part of today's panel, which will be final remarks from the panelists. just 1 minute for each. But here's the final question, Daniel. I think it's directed to you, which is, I think this is a straightforward one, which is, what is the estimated time frame for General Assembly adoption if that happens?
So again, trying to be careful with the process we are conducting with all member states. Our decision has been to put forward this resolution for adoption by the General Assembly during the current session. So the 76th session. The 76th session finishes in about 2 months. So that means we have set ourselves our timeline, but also the deadline for the General Assembly to take action. Of course, we intend the General Assembly to take action by the end of July. So that means that we have ahead of us a couple of weeks, more than 2 weeks probably, to finish this process with member states. So this is where how the timeline looks like.
Okay. All right, thank you, Daniel. So that concludes our discussion. If you have additional questions, that there were some we didn't get to, my apologies about that. The suggestion is to post them on the blog for the Global Network on the Right to a Healthy Environment to continue a conversation about any of those questions that you have. Thank you so much for submitting the questions that you did. They were interesting and innovative and really challenging to the panel. Thanks again. So let's conclude with any final brief remarks from the panel, going in the same order in which we started. Patricia, beginning with you. Thank you.
I think very quickly, it's timely that we're discussing the right to a healthy environment. The rights-based approach is a very good anchor for the promotion of a healthy environment, and it will definitely give momentum to other issues that are being raised, such as the declaration for future generations.
Okay. Thank you, Patricia. David, over to you.
Thanks, Jimmy. 2 quick points. One is I'd love to borrow the metaphor that Patricia used earlier about this resolution putting the wind in the sails of the UN Environment Program, and say that it also will put the wind in the sails of those millions of people around the world who are so courageously defending their rights to water, their rights to clean air, their rights to land, their traditional territories in the case of indigenous peoples. Those people are putting their lives and their safety on the line for all of us, because ultimately, you know, in a world where we focus on the differences between people in the color of their skin, their religions, their national origins, one thing that we all have in common is that we all breathe the same air. We all drink the same water. We all depend on the Earth's climate for our future prosperity. And so the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is something that should really unite us all, because we all depend on this incredible, wonderful blue-green planet that we're so lucky to be living on.
Thank you, David. Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. It is really a commitment and a real honor to be working towards the universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We are so excited, the 5 countries co-presenters of this text, but also we feel the support, and we are positive that this recognition will happen at the General Assembly very soon. So we look forward to working with all member states, but also with all of you, all actors involved in this long history of this right, and hopefully we'll have a successful outcome very soon. So an invitation to everyone to stay on the loop, to stay informed, to look for the information, to ask us for information, because we need this support. We need also this pressure by all the involved actors. So thanking you again, and for this very timely event.
And thank you, Daniel, for being a part of it. Maria Antonia, you get the last word.
With a responsibility. I just might finalize this, even that I'm also very hopeful that this is going to pass, and just echoing again that it's a real privilege to see this process going forward. I think it will answer a lot of questions, but it will also raise a lot of questions. So maybe I'll end with this invitation. They put it in here in the chat that at the Global Network of Human Rights in the Environment, we're launching a blog post symposium, short contributions about this recognition and what that means. And I would really welcome, everyone to contribute to that. It's about 1,500 words, so it's a short, some short thoughts on it, and hopefully we can get like a broad range of perspectives, like the ones here on the panel, and also relating to the questions that were asked, right? So, so yeah, I really invite this conversation to move forward. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
Thank you, Maria Antonia, and thank you, panel, for those wonderful contributions to this conversation about the right to a healthy environment and for keeping us on time throughout. Now, let me give everyone a quick glimpse of what's to come, which there are 2 more programs of this 3-part series. The first, or the next one, which is actually the second, sorry, is July 13th. It's a week from today, the same time, same place, same station. And it's on the United States' consideration of the right to a healthy environment. Nadia Ahmad will moderate it, and the panelists include John Knox, Peggy Shepard, Dan McGraw, Ashfaq Khalfan, and Nakiba Brown. And then the following week, 2 weeks from today, on July 20th, the topic will be subnational consideration of the right to a healthy environment in the United States and implications of UNGA recognition. It will be moderated by Christine Perry with panelists including Justice Todd Edens, Marie Margol, and me. So on behalf of ELI and all the sponsors, and on behalf of the panel, again, thank you for being a part of this. Let me thank the panel again for just a fantastic conversation with Patricia and David and Daniel and Maria Antonia. Also thanking the sponsors and most of all you who took time to listen to what we had to say, and both now and whenever you watch this in the future. So that concludes session 1 of this 3-part webinar. Again, on behalf of everyone, thanks for being a part of it. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Good luck, Daniel.